The hour of the hunt begins.
The iron was still hot when it hit her skin. Freyja didn't scream. She wanted to. God, every nerve in her body was begging her to. But she bit down on her own cheek until she tasted copper, and she held it. She would not give Thorne the sound. She would not give him that. The brand lifted. The smell stayed. Burnt skin. Her skin. The pack mark she'd carried since birth. Gone in 4 seconds of white-hot silver pressed against her collarbone by a man who hadn't even flinched doing it. Thorne crouched to her level. His amber eyes swept over her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. The Deadlands will finish what I started. He stood, straightened his furs, bored already. If you're lucky, you'll be dead before they find you. The gate slammed. The blizzard swallowed her whole. She crawled. She didn't know for how long. The snow turned pink beneath her hands. Her collarbone was a screaming open wound, and the cold was the only thing keeping her conscious. Then the snow stopped falling. Not slowed. Stopped. Like something had simply decided it would. Freyja raised her head. 7 silhouettes stood in the dark ahead of her. Massive, still, watching. The largest one went to his knees and bowed. Not the silence of safety, the silence of something deciding. Freyja had grown up on stories about the feral kings. Every child in the northern packs had. You misbehaved, you got dragged to the border fence and shown the Deadlands, that gray, lightless stretch of frozen nothing beyond the tree line. And your parents would crouch beside you and say the same thing every parent said. They're out there, and they don't leave bones. She had believed it the way children believe in most things, completely and without needing proof. She believed it considerably more now, kneeling in the snow with 7 of them standing 15 feet away from her, utterly motionless, watching her bleed. The largest one was still on his knee, head bowed, long silver hair hanging forward over his face like a curtain, catching no light because there was no light to catch. Just the dark. Just the howling white nothing of the blizzard at her back, and this wall of stillness in front of her, and the blood from her collarbone dripping steadily into the snow between her palms. She should run. There was nowhere to run to. She knew that. She ran the calculation anyway, because her brain was still doing the things brains do when they haven't accepted yet that it's over. Yields mapping exits that didn't exist, measuring distances her legs couldn't cover. The kneeling one raised his head. His eyes were the color of something that had been red for so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. He didn't speak. He looked at her collarbone, at the raw, weeping brand, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not pity. Pity was soft. This was harder than that. This was the expression of someone cataloging damage with the very specific intention of finding whoever caused it. He reached up slowly, deliberately, like you'd move around a cornered animal. He unclasped the heavy, dark cloak from his own shoulders. Freyja flinched back. Her hand shot up. Don't. He stopped. She hadn't expected that. Every alpha she had ever encountered, every dominant, every ranking male in Thorne's pack. They didn't stop when she said, don't. That wasn't how it worked. Her voice had never been the kind that made things stop. The feral king remained perfectly still in the blizzard, cloak extended, waiting. Freyja's arm was shaking. She wasn't sure when that had started. The cold, probably. Blood loss, maybe. She looked at his face again, really looked, and tried to find the threat in it, tried to find what she knew. The sneering assessment, the casual cruelty, the particular kind of boredom that men like Thorne wore when they looked at her. It wasn't there. What was there was harder to process. It sat somewhere between fury and reverence, and she didn't have a category for it, so her mind kept sliding off it like water off stone. She stopped fighting the shaking and let him put the cloak around her shoulders. It was warm, obscenely, almost violently warm, like it had been sitting beside a fire for hours, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a physical decision. Like the cold had been a choice she'd been making, and someone had just removed the option. Her eyes burned. She pressed her teeth together and refused to let that mean anything. "You're not going to eat me," she said. It came out flat. A statement, not a question, because she'd already decided she wasn't going to die asking. The silver-haired one, Kaelen, though she didn't know that yet, wouldn't know it for another hour, stood to his full height. She'd estimated 7 feet from the ground. Standing, she revised that upward. He turned and walked into the dark. The others shifted. A silent reorganization. 2 of them moved to her flanks, not grabbing, not pushing, simply there, their presence rerouting her options so naturally that she'd taken 4 steps forward before she consciously chose to follow. The largest of the remaining ones drew up beside her left shoulder. Bald head, tattoos running from his scalp down his neck and disappearing beneath armor. Bare arms in a blizzard, which should have been insane, and on him somehow looked like a weather condition he'd simply declined to acknowledge. He glanced down at her. She glared up at him. He looked away first. She filed that away and kept walking. The fortress materialized out of the dark the way bad memories do, gradually, and then all at once. Massive, ancient, the kind of structure that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It had been here before anyone living had been born, and the stones knew it, and they wore that knowledge in every crack and every moss-dark surface and every window that watched their approach like a row of hollow eyes. Freyja had lived her entire life in the Northern Pack's territory, their lodges, their training grounds, their great hall with Thorne's banners hanging from the rafters, structures built to impress, built to remind you of exactly who owned them. This was different. This hadn't been built to impress anyone. It had been built to last. There was something almost geological about it. Like the fortress and the Deadlands had simply agreed to exist together, and the agreement was older than language. The gates were already open. She almost stopped walking at that. Something about open gates, in the dark, leading somewhere she couldn't fully see. Her body registered it before her mind did, a tightening low in her sternum. She walked through, anyway. What was the alternative? The inside was lit by fires. Not torches, actual fires, burning in massive iron basins, throwing orange and amber light up walls that disappeared into darkness somewhere far above. The ceiling was up there. She couldn't see it. She had the distinct and unsettling impression it was very, very high. The warmth hit her like a physical impact. Her knees nearly went. She grabbed a stone column to her left and held on and did not fall, because she wasn't going to fall, not here, not in front of... Sit. First word any of them had said. Low voice. The silver-haired one. Kaelen. He'd stopped beside a low stone bench near the nearest fire basin and was looking at her with that same expression she couldn't categorize. "I'll stand," she said. "You're about to collapse. I'll stand while I'm doing that." Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement, exactly. Something adjacent to it, buried under several other things, briefly visible and then gone. He moved to the fire basin, crouched beside it. From somewhere, a pack she hadn't noticed, a fold in his armor. He produced a small clay vessel, set it near the flame, settled back on his heels and waited with the patience of someone who was used to measuring time in centuries, not minutes. Freyja watched him. Her collarbone was a constant throbbing scream that she was separating herself from through sheer necessity. She'd learned how to do that years ago. Not in any training session, not from any mentor. She'd learned it the first time Thorne had made an example of her during ranking trials. She'd been 17, he'd been 26, and he'd chosen her specifically because she was the smallest, and the lesson he'd been teaching hadn't really been about her at all. She'd learned then that pain was a room you could step outside of. You couldn't lock the door, but you could stand in the hallway and let it shout through the gap and just not go back in. Not yet. Not until you were somewhere it was safe to feel it. She'd been looking for somewhere safe for 8 years. The clay vessel began to steam. Kaelen lifted it from the heat with bare hands, carried it to the bench he'd indicated before, and set it down. Then he looked at her. A question, without asking it. "What is that?" Freyja said. "Something old." He paused. "For the burn, it'll draw the silver residue out of the wound. If it's left, the mark becomes permanent in a different way." She'd known that. She hadn't let herself think about it too directly. Silver brands were Thorne's specific cruelty of choice. Pack law technically required a simple banishment. Thorne had added the brand himself. Silver in the wound meant it would never fully heal right, meant she'd carry the scar without the ghost of the mark, without the pack bond, without anything except the damage. A reminder, not of belonging, of removal. "You're not going to ask me to come closer," she said. "No, you're just going to leave it there." "Yes." Freyja looked at the vessel, looked at the distance between herself and the bench, looked at him, crouched a careful, deliberate 3 feet away from it, making himself small in the way that large things only bother to do when they're trying very hard not to frighten something. She crossed the room and sat down. She felt the bench take her weight and felt every muscle she'd been holding rigid for the last, she didn't know how long, begin the slow, involuntary process of unknotting, and she hated it. Hated the vulnerability of her own body deciding it was allowed to rest, hated that her hands were shaking visibly now, and there was nothing she could do about it. She dipped her fingers in the vessel. The liquid was warm and smelled of iron and something underneath it, green and sharp, like pine needles and ozone after lightning. She pressed it to her collarbone. The pain crested and broke and then, slowly, did something she hadn't expected. It began, or incrementally, to recede. Not gone, but further away. Like someone had moved the room she wasn't going back into slightly further down the hall. She looked up. Kaelen hadn't moved, wasn't watching her wound, was watching her face with an expression she was beginning to tentatively, cautiously, identify as something like concern, unfamiliar on a face that severe, like a blade someone had tried to use as a pillow. From the doorway, the tattooed one, she'd find out his name was Bastian, hadn't moved either. He was standing with his back to the hall, arms crossed, facing out, guarding the door. Her door. Freyja's hand stilled against her collarbone. She looked at that, at the specific set of his shoulders, at the way he'd positioned himself. Not watching her, not monitoring her, but outward-facing, threat-facing, so positioned between her and whatever might come through. No one had ever... She shut that thought down hard, stapled it closed, filed it under irrelevant and dangerous, and turned back to the fire. Outside, in the far dark of the Deadlands, the blizzard resumed, as if it had simply been waiting for her to get inside. She told herself that was coincidence. She almost believed it. She held on to that almost. It was the most honest thing she'd felt in hours. The fire settled into a slower rhythm, and Freyja sat with the warm clay vessel cradled in both hands and let herself exist in the strange, suspended unreality of still being alive. She'd done the math on her own survival so many times in the last few hours, crouched over it, turned it, found every angle, and every version had ended the same way, in the Deadlands, alone, before dawn. She was still here. The wound on her collarbone had quieted to a dull, insistent throb. She pressed her fingers to the edge of it carefully, not looking down. She didn't need to see it. She could feel the geography of it well enough. The shape Thorne had chosen. Deliberate. The brand of Exile wasn't a simple mark. It was a negation. A line drawn through everything she'd been. She had been born into that pack. Not chosen. Born. Her mother had died inside those gates, in a small room at the edge of the southern lodge, when Freyja was 4 years old. She didn't remember her face clearly anymore. Just the quality of her hands, rough and careful, and the sound of her voice reading the old stories in the dark. Freyja had spent years being angry at herself for that, for the forgetting, as if grief was supposed to be archival, as if she owed her mother a perfect memory in place of the life they should have had. She set the vessel down on the stone bench beside her. Kaelen hadn't moved. He was still crouched near the fire basin, forearms resting on his knees, watching the flame rather than her now, and there was something in the specific quality of his stillness that she was beginning to understand wasn't indifference. It was consideration. He was giving her the room to feel what she needed to feel, without the pressure of being observed feeling it. No one had ever done that either. She was going to have to stop noticing these things, or she was going to lose her mind. "How long have you been waiting?" she said. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out of something below planning. Kaelen turned his head. The firelight caught the left side of his face and left the right in shadow, and for a moment he looked like something out of the stories, not the monster version, the older version, the one that existed before the stories got simplified into warnings. "For you, specifically," he considered it with the gravity of someone who didn't treat questions carelessly. 217 years. Freyja looked at him. "For someone like you," he continued, and his voice carried the particular weight of words that had been held a long time. "The answer has always been since the beginning. We simply didn't have a number to put on it until recently. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I have." She should have found that unsettling. She catalogued the fact that she didn't and filed it alongside everything else she wasn't examining yet. There was a pile forming somewhere at the back of her mind. She'd deal with it later. She'd been building that pile her whole life. All the things that didn't fit the shape of the world she'd been handed. All the moments where something had flickered under her skin that she didn't have words for, that she'd learned to bury quickly and quietly before anyone noticed. The first time had been when she was 11. She hadn't thought about that in years. Didn't know why it surfaced now in a burning hall in the Deadlands, surrounded by ancient monsters who bowed instead of attacked. Maybe the wound, maybe the particular quality of the firelight, maybe just the catastrophic loosening that happens to a person when they've been through enough in one night and the defenses start to drop whether they want them to or not. She had been 11. And it had been a ranking trial, and Thorne had been 17 and already enormous, and already certain of himself in the way that certain kinds of people are certain before they've earned it. He'd been demonstrating a dominance technique to the older pups, how to break a low rank's concentration using alpha pressure, flooding a target's senses until they folded. The instructor had needed a subject. Freyja had been the smallest. She remembered the moment his dominance hit her. The room had buckled under it. Every other pup in that space had dropped to their knees within seconds. She could see them in her peripheral vision, one by one, going down like candles in a hard wind. She had not gone down. She didn't know why. She hadn't been trying to resist. She'd had no framework for resistance, no training. So no reason to believe she was anything other than the smallest, lowest-ranking Omega in a room full of her superiors. She'd simply stood there while Thorne's pressure crashed over her and felt it, felt the full weight of it, felt it the way you'd feel a wave, and then felt something else move in her underneath it. something that met the pressure and held. Thorne had looked at her for a very long time after that. He'd said nothing. The instructor had moved on. But Thorne had looked at her, and she had understood, even at 11, that she had done something she wasn't supposed to do, and that he had noticed, and that being noticed by someone like him was not the same thing as being seen. After that, it started, slowly enough that she could almost convince herself it wasn't a pattern. The assignments that kept her out of advanced training. The ranking adjustments that moved her further down the hierarchy without any infraction she could point to. The subtle structural exclusion that looked like bureaucracy until you stood back far enough to see the shape of it. And then it looked exactly like what it was. One person methodically dismantling another person's standing, piece by piece, over the course of years, with the patience of someone who knew they had all the time in the world. She'd told herself it was her imagination. She'd told herself that right up until the night, 6 months ago, when she'd woken to find 2 of Thorne's ranking betas in her room, with a written exile order and orders not to give her time to dress. "You're somewhere else." Kaelen's voice, low, not intrusive, more like a door being knocked on rather than opened. Freyja came back to the hall. The fire, the bench. Her hands were still in her lap. She wasn't sure when they'd stopped shaking. She looked down at them as if checking in with something she'd momentarily misplaced. "I'm here," she said. "You don't have to be." Not entirely. He had turned back to the fire. "You've earned some distance tonight." She studied the side of his face, the clean severity of it, the way he held himself. That constant, deliberate containment, like something large moving carefully through a space it knew it could damage. "You said 217 years. She watched him. What happens when you wait that long for something, and it finally arrives? The question landed in the room and sat there. She hadn't meant it to carry everything it was carrying. She hadn't meant to make it a question about herself, about what it might mean to be arrived at, to be the thing someone had been waiting for after a lifetime of being treated like something to be removed. But those things were in it. She heard them as soon as she stopped speaking. Kaelen was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "You become very careful not to treat it like something you own." Freyja didn't say anything. "Waiting creates a kind of gravity," he continued, still looking at the fire, his voice careful in the way of someone choosing words not for impact, but for accuracy. "You can mistake it for ownership, for entitlement. You wait long enough for something, you start to think the waiting itself is a form of claim." He paused. "It isn't." She looked at the wound on her collarbone without meaning to, the place where Thorne had pressed his claim, his removal of it. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." The rain outside, she hadn't noticed when the blizzard had become rain, when the temperature had shifted, tapped steadily against the high stone windows. Bastian's silhouette in the doorway hadn't moved. From somewhere deeper in the fortress, she could hear the low, distant sounds of the other kings settling. Boots on stone. The muffled, brief sound of a voice. Then quiet again. It occurred to her, sitting in that hall, that she had never in her life been in a place where no one was watching her for weakness. Not really. Not even when she'd been alone. Because alone in Thorne's pack had never truly meant private. There were always the social mechanics to be aware of, the hierarchy constantly performing itself, constantly demanding participation, constantly requiring her to be smaller, quieter, less. She had spent 8 years perfecting the performance of smallness. She had gotten very, very good at it. She wondered what was left underneath it, whether there was a version of herself she hadn't performed into non-existence yet. Whether the thing that had surfaced at 11, that quiet, braced internal holding, was still intact somewhere below all the scar tissue. She pressed her fingers to the warm clay vessel again. Let the heat ground her. The others, she said. Do they all... She stopped. Rephrased. What do they know about me? Everything we've been able to learn. He turned to look at her now, fully. Which is less than we'd like, and more than you'd probably be comfortable with. Try me. We know your mother was Era of the old northern bloodline. We know what she carried in her blood and what she passed to you. We know what you did at 11 during the ranking trial because we have someone who was there. He watched her face carefully as he said it, not to gauge her reaction. It didn't feel like that, more like he was trying to show her he was tracking what it cost her to hear. We know what Thorne has been doing to suppress you for the last 8 years, and we know that everything he's taken from you, everything he's burned and buried and clipped back, none of it is gone. It's been going somewhere. The rain outside, the fire between them. The specific, unbearable weight of being known by a stranger when you'd spent years being unseen by people who were supposed to love you. Going where? She said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Kaelen looked at her with those red dark eyes, and for the first time since she'd knelt in the snow and watched him bow, she felt the full scope of what he was. Ancient, patient, absolutely certain. Here, he said simply. It's been going here. Freyja looked into the fire. The wound on her collarbone throbbed once, deeply, and she felt something she couldn't name move in the hollow below it. Not pain, not warmth, something older than both. Something that felt, terrifyingly, like the very first syllable of a language she'd never been taught, but had somehow always known. She pressed her hand flat against the burn and felt it pulse against her palm. Outside, the rain fell steadily against the stones of the oldest fortress in the Deadlands, and somewhere in the dark above the fires, the ceiling she still couldn't see held all of it quietly, the way old things hold everything. Without comment, without judgment, simply present and waiting, and absolutely sure of what was coming next. She was not sure yet, but for the first time in 8 years, she didn't feel the specific, exhausting weight of being the only one who didn't know how the story ended. That would have to be enough. For now it was. And then the fire went out. Not slowly, not the natural guttering of fuel exhausted. Every basin in the hall, 4 of them, massive iron, burning steadily a moment ago, extinguished simultaneously, as if the room had inhaled and simply kept the air. The dark that replaced them was total. Freyja was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. The clay vessel hit the stone floor somewhere to her left. She heard it but couldn't track it. Her eyes were doing what eyes do in complete darkness, manufacturing shapes from nothing, sketching threats onto the black that may or may not have been there. She'd learned not to trust that. She'd also learned not to completely dismiss it. Bastian's voice came from the doorway, not alarmed, flat and very focused. 2 words in a language she didn't recognize. Kaelen answered in the same language, shorter. 1 word, then silence. Then from somewhere above, from that ceiling she'd never been able to see, a sound she had no category for, not a creak, not a crack, something between the two, sustained. Like the stone itself was under pressure, like the fortress was being pressed from the outside by something with enough weight to register in the architecture. Don't move, Kaelen said, in her language this time, directly to her. Something's outside. Yes, Thorne's scouts. A pause that told her things the pause wasn't trying to tell her. Not exactly. She stood in the dark and listened. She was good at listening. 8 years of low rank had made her exceptional at it, at parsing the specific frequencies of threat, at reading the architecture of a room through sound alone, the rate of other people's breathing, the particular quality of silence before something moved. What she was hearing now didn't fit any pattern she'd accumulated. It wasn't scouts. Scouts moved with deliberate quiet, compressed sound. on a weight distributed carefully, the specific controlled absence of noise that trained personnel produced. This was different. This was something that didn't care whether it was heard, because it had made a calculation about being heard and found it irrelevant. Whatever was outside the fortress walls was not concerned about her knowing it was there. A light appeared. Small, moving, orange. Kaelen had found a single candle somewhere in the dark, a squat, functional thing that produced just enough light to carve his face out of the black. He held it low. He was looking at the ceiling. Freyja looked up. The ceiling was there after all. She'd been right that it was high, 30 feet, maybe more, the stone vaulted and ancient and crossed with carved channels that she'd taken, on first impression, for decoration. She could see now that they weren't. They ran in patterns too deliberate for ornament, too interconnected. Each channel linked to the next, and each intersection was marked with a symbol she didn't know but recognized in the same wordless way she'd recognized the language below the cello note, not with her mind, with something below it. The symbols were glowing, faintly, the color of something that had been a hotter color once and cooled, like metal after the forge, like the specific amber red of a coal deciding whether to die or not. "What is that?" she said. "A record," Kaelen said. He was still watching the ceiling. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him yet. Not fear, something more structural. The tone of someone assessing a problem they'd prepared for but had hoped not to encounter this soon. "Oh, the fortress keeps its own history, carves it." He paused. "It's been adding to itself since you walked through the gate." Freyja stared at the glowing channels, watched the light in them pulse once, deeply, in a rhythm she recognized with a jolt of pure physical alarm. It matched the pulse she'd felt beneath her hand when she'd pressed it to her wound. Same interval, same weight. "It's responding to me," she said. "It's been waiting for you. There's a difference." He finally looked down from the ceiling directly at her. The candle between them made his eyes look less red and more like amber, like something preserved. The fortress was built by the first witches. Not for us, for whoever came after us, for the one who would come after a very long waiting. The pressing sound from outside intensified. The stone groaned again. "How longer this time? You need to tell me what's outside," Freyja said. Kaelen set the candle on the floor between them, straightened. In the low light, his armor looked like the surface of something geological, layered, dark, built up over time rather than made. "Before Thorne's men left the Deadlands border tonight," he said, "they passed through the outer markers. Old ones, bone markers set by the first witches to delineate where their territory began." He watched her face as he spoke. "When a marked exile crosses into this territory, the outer markers send a signal, not to us, to what lives in the deeper Deadlands." What lives in the deeper Deadlands? Things that were here before us. He said it without drama. That was somehow worse than if he'd said it with some. We have an arrangement with most of them. Boundaries. Agreements about territory and passage. The arrangement relies on the markers being intact. Freyja understood before he finished. Thorne's scouts broke the markers crossing through. Snapped 2 of them. They won't have known what they were. To an outside eye, they look like natural formations. He paused. To whatever is currently pressing on the north wall, the broken markers read as an announcement. An announcement of what? That the territory is open, he said. That the compact is dissolved. That anything currently inside the boundary is no longer under negotiated protection. The north wall shuddered. Not violently, steadily, with the horrible patience of something that understood leverage. Freyja felt it through the floor, up through the soles of her feet, into her knees. Whatever this thing weighed, the earth was registering an opinion about it. From the doorway, Bastian spoke again. That same flat, focused register. This time she caught a word she recognized, not from any language she'd been taught, from somewhere below language, from the same place the symbols in the ceiling had come from. The word was a name, and it was hers. She processed that for one moment, set it aside, returned to it, set it aside again. The arrangement, she said. Can it be restored? The markers can be reset. It requires someone who carries the original bloodline to place new ones. Kaelen's eyes were on her collarbone, on the wound. The blood of the first witches pressed into each marker site. The wound pulsed. She felt it without touching it. How far are the marker sites? The broken ones are 400 meters north of the outer wall. In the dark? Yes. While whatever is pressing on the north wall is between us and them. That's the geometric problem, yes. Freyja looked at the candle, looked at the ceiling, where the symbols continued their slow, coal-colored pulse. Looked at the doorway where Bastian's massive silhouette had shifted slightly. She understood now that he'd repositioned, moved to the side that would put him between the north wall and her if something came through. She thought about 8 years of being the thing in the room that needed protecting. She thought about what Kaelen had said. It's been going somewhere. Here. It's been going here. She crossed to the doorway. Bastian turned. Not to stop her, she registered that. Say, just to track her movement. And she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and in the candlelight his eyes were golden and very steady. The outer door, she said. Which direction? His expression moved through several things quickly, and settled on something that was not quite respect and not quite alarm, and was probably both simultaneously. He jerked his head. Left. The corridor outside the hall was colder than the hall had been, substantially in a way that registered as more than just distance from the fire, the kind of cold that has a source, a specific directional cold, coming from the north end of the corridor, seeping under the door that stood at its end with the particular intensity of something waiting to be let in. The symbols from the ceiling continued in the walls here too. She could see them in the dark without Kaelen's candle. They were brighter out here, the pulse in them faster. Tracking her, she understood, not following, recognizing. She stopped in front of the north door. It was iron, old iron, the surface of it patterned with rust and with something below the rust that wasn't rust, darker, organic, in the same patterns as the ceiling. She put her hand flat against it, not to open it, just to listen. There was breathing on the other side, not close. The breathing was happening at a scale that made close irrelevant. She could hear it through iron and stone because of the volume of air being moved. Whatever produced it was large enough that its respiration was a weather event, and it had paused. The rhythmic, methodical pressure on the north wall had stopped the moment she'd touched the door. She understood, standing there with her palm against old iron in the dark, that the thing on the other side of the wall had felt her make contact, had felt through the stone and the ancient markers and whatever network the first witches had built into the bones of this place, the specific signature of her blood, and had stopped to listen. Kaelen had followed her. She could hear him a few feet behind. That particular quality of controlled movement, of something large being very deliberate about the space it occupied. Bastian further back. The other kings somewhere else in the fortress, and she was aware of them the way you're aware of weight distribution in a structure. Not seeing them, but sensing where the mass was. If I go out there, she said without turning around, and I place the markers, what happens to the thing against the wall? It will recognize the compact and withdraw. You're certain. Another pause with information in it. The compact has held for 3 centuries without interruption. We have no reason to believe the terms have changed. That's not certain. No. She stood with her hand on the door and felt the wound on her collarbone, and felt the pulse in the walls, and felt, underneath both of those, that thing she still didn't have a name for, that held, braced interior quality that had surfaced at 11 and apparently never left. She had been exiled tonight, branded, walked into the Deadlands expecting to die, had been bowed to instead and wrapped in a stranger's cloak and given something warm for her wound and told that everything Thorne had stripped from her had been going somewhere. So she thought, if it's been going somewhere, it should be useful by now. She pushed the door open. The cold hit her like a wall. The dark beyond the door was a different quality of dark than the corridor, wider, deeper, outdoor dark, with the specific texture of open ground and no stars. The blizzard had stopped entirely. The rain had stopped. The air was absolutely still in the way that air is still inside a held breath. She stepped through. The snow beyond the door was unmarked. No tracks. Whatever had been pressing against the north wall had not come around to this side. She looked north along the wall and saw nothing, just the dark and the flat expanse of snow, and somewhere at the edge of her vision, at the limit of what the fortress's faint ambient light reached, a shape. Not moving. Waiting. It was too large to resolve into a specific form at this distance. She got an impression of mass, of height, of something that had been in this territory long enough that it had stopped looking like a visitor and started looking like a feature of the landscape. It had a stillness to it that wasn't the stillness of animals or of people. It was geological, tidal. It was looking at her. She knew that with the same certainty. She knew her own heartbeat. She pressed her wounded hand to her collarbone, covered the brand, felt the warmth of her own blood against her palm. Fresher than she'd expected, the cold had kept it from fully clotting, and she turned north and began to walk toward the broken markers. Behind her, from the doorway, she heard Kaelen draw a single, slow breath. He didn't call her back. She walked. The thing at the edge of the dark watched every step, and then it moved, not toward her, around her, a slow lateral repositioning that covered ground with an efficiency that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with scale. One moment it was north, then it was northeast. Then it was simply everywhere ahead of her because it was large enough that ahead had become a relative concept. Freyja kept walking. She could feel each footfall through the ground before she heard it. A compression that traveled up through her boot soles, through her ankles, into her knees. Whatever this thing weighed, the earth was registering an opinion about it. 50 meters to the markers. She'd counted her paces from the door, 43 now. The wound on her collarbone had stopped throbbing. That was either very good or the particular kind of very bad, where the body stops reporting damage because it's identified something more immediate to deal with. She didn't investigate which. 38 meters. The thing stopped moving. It was directly ahead of her. She could see it now. Not clearly. The dark was doing what dark does, suggesting rather than confirming. But enough. It was tall in the way that things are tall when they've grown without any particular pressure to stop. 12 feet, maybe 14. The shape of it was broadly upright, broadly bilateral, but the details were wrong in ways she couldn't fully inventory at this distance. Too many joints in the arms. The head at an angle that suggested its neck worked differently than a neck should. It hadn't moved. She hadn't stopped. 30 meters. It made a sound. All that click. Then another. A pattern. 3 clicks. A pause. 2 clicks. She didn't know what it meant. She understood the intent, though. She'd grown up in a pack. She knew the specific frequency of I see you and I am deciding. She slowed but didn't stop. 26 meters. Behind her, 100 meters back, at the fortress door, she heard Bastian's voice. Short, tense, not calling to her. talking to Kaelen. She didn't need to hear the words. The tone was a word in itself. Too close. She was too close. 20 meters. The thing clicked again. Different pattern. Faster. Freyja stopped walking. Not because she was afraid. She was afraid. She wasn't pretending she wasn't. The fear was a clean and useful thing sitting in her chest, telling her accurate information about her situation. She stopped because she needed both hands, and moving while doing this would split her focus, and she didn't have focus to spare. She pressed her right hand flat against the wound. The pain came back the moment she put pressure on it. Good. She needed it to come back. She needed the blood that had been slowly working its way out of the wound since the clay vessel's effects had started wearing off in the cold. She pressed harder, felt the fresh wet of it against her palm, looked up at the thing 14 meters away from her. "I'm placing the markers," she said, out loud, flat. "Give me 2 minutes." The clicking stopped. She didn't know if that was yes. She committed to it being yes and dropped to her knees in the snow. The marker sites were exactly where they should have been. She knew that the way she'd been knowing things tonight, so below the level of having been told. 2 spots, 4 meters apart, where the snow was disturbed and the ground below it had been broken. Thorne's scouts had gone through here like they owned it. Snapped the bone markers clean. The pieces were still in the snow. She could see them now that she was low, pale against the white. She found the first sight, pressed her bloody palm into the broken base, felt the ground under her hand, and felt, simultaneously, the symbols in the fortress walls 100 meters behind her spike in brightness. She couldn't see them from here, but she felt them, the same way you feel a light turn on in a room behind you. The thing ahead of her made a sound that wasn't clicking. Lower, chest deep, a sound that traveled through the air and through the ground at the same time, layered. And she understood it was a response to what she'd just done, not aggression, recognition, the compact acknowledging itself. One sight done. She moved to the second, 4 meters. She covered it fast and dropped again and pressed both hands this time, wound side down, into the disturbed earth. The hum got louder. Her collarbone screamed. She pushed through it. The ground under her hands cracked. A clean split radiating out from her palms, 2 feet in each direction, and from the crack came light. The same coal amber as the symbols, and the light ran along the ground in both directions, fast, following some channels she couldn't see, connecting to the fortress wall and to whatever further markers existed beyond her line of sight. The compact, re-establishing itself, running the circuit. The thing ahead of her went absolutely still. Then it stepped back. 1 step, 2. It retreated with the same methodical patience it had advanced with, covering ground without urgency, receding into the dark. The last thing she saw was its outline, and then the dark closed over it like water, and it was gone, and the clicking was gone, and the pressure in the ground was gone. Freyja stayed on her knees in the snow for 3 seconds. Then the sound hit. Not from the creature. From the east, from the direction of the Deadlands border, from the direction of Thorne's territory. The sound was structured, organized, deliberate. It was the sound that a large number of people make when they've stopped trying to be quiet because they've decided they no longer need to be. Howling. Not the irregular, communicative howling of a pack mid-hunt. The synchronized, or building howl of a pack being called to war. She was on her feet before the echo finished. She turned and ran. The snow grabbed at her boots, deep, uneven, a full-body resistance that she pushed through with everything she had. The fortress door was a rectangle of faint amber light 100 meters away. She fixed on it and ran. Behind her, the howling built. It was close. Too close. Thorne hadn't sent scouts this time. He'd come himself. 60 meters. She heard them hit the Deadlands border behind her, heard the specific cacophony of a large group crossing rough terrain at speed, not caring about the noise, not caring about the markers, about the compact, about any of the things that lived in these territories and had arrangements about being respected. Thorne had never respected anything he couldn't physically dominate. 50 meters. Something hit the snow 10 feet to her left. Hard. Fast. Ahead of the pack, a scout or a runner, someone Thorne had sent forward to cut her off. She didn't look. Looking cost a stride, and she didn't have strides to spare. 40 meters. A hand caught her hood. The cloak, Kaelen's cloak, tore at the collar where the hand grabbed it. The momentum spun her half around, one boot losing purchase in the snow, and she went down on one knee and came back up in the same motion, abandoning the cloak, leaving it in whoever's fist had grabbed it. She was in the cold now, properly in it. The blizzard hadn't returned, but the temperature hadn't gone anywhere, and without the cloak the night air went straight through her ruined leather like it wasn't there. 30 meters to the door. The figure behind her was fast, pack-trained. She could hear breathing at her left shoulder, controlled, paced, someone who ran for distance, not just speed. A beta. Thorne sent betas for retrieval, faster than omegas, disciplined enough to bring back a target intact. 20 meters. The beta grabbed her arm. She dropped her weight, twisted into the grab instead of away from it, and put her elbow into the beta's sternum with everything she had. Not a technique, not training, just the specific violence of someone who has run out of other options. The beta's breath left him in a single hard grunt. His grip broke. She ran. 10 meters. The doorway. Bastian filling it completely, a wall of tattooed mass in the amber light. And his expression when he saw her coming was the particular expression of someone who had decided several seconds ago what they were about to do and had just been waiting for her to clear the line. She hit the doorway at full speed. He stepped aside, barely, just enough, and she was through, and she was in the corridor, and she was inside. Bastian didn't follow her in. He stepped out, into the snow, into the dark, into the advancing sound of Thorne's pack at the border of his territory. And the door swung shut behind him, not closed, shut, the iron finding its seat with the finality of something that had been doing this for centuries. And through the iron she heard the specific sound of one very large, very prepared man meeting a problem head-on. It was not a quiet sound. Freyja stood in the corridor with her hand on the iron door, and her lungs burning and her collarbone open again. She could feel the wet of it against her ruined leather. And she listened to what was happening on the other side of the door and understood several things in quick succession. First, Thorne had come with numbers. She could tell by the acoustic scale of the combat. Bastian was one person and the sound was big enough for 10. Second, Bastian didn't seem to need the numbers to be smaller. Third, Thorne wasn't outside yet. He'd sent his betas first, which meant he was hanging back, which meant he was afraid of something, and fear in Thorne always produced the same result. It made him more dangerous, not less, because his pride couldn't survive being seen as afraid, and he would do anything to neutralize the evidence of it. Kaelen appeared at the end of the corridor, moving fast, not running, but covering ground with the kind of efficiency that made running look inefficient. He took in the torn collar, the open wound, the door, the sounds outside, and said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then, how many? Enough that he thinks it's sufficient, Freyja said. So, not enough. Something moved in his expression, passed fast, gone. The others are on the walls, he said. Bastian has the east approach. The west and north gates are sealed. He stopped in front of her and looked at the wound with that same inventory expression. Damage catalogued, source identified, response being formulated. You reset the markers. Yes, The compact creature gone. He nodded once, not in relief, in the manner of someone removing a variable from a calculation and moving immediately to the remaining ones. From somewhere above them, the walls, the battlements, wherever the other kings had positioned themselves, came the sounds of the fortress actively disagreeing with Thorne's army. It wasn't the sound of a siege being weathered. It was the sound of a siege being rejected. There was a violence to it that was specific and personal, and she understood, listening, that the feral kings weren't defending a position. They were delivering a message. "He's going to push through to the courtyard," Freyja said. "Thorne. He'll let the betas absorb the first engagement, and then he'll come through himself with his ranking wolves. It's what he does." Kaelen looked at her. "I grew up watching him," she said flatly. "I know how he wastes people." The fortress shook once. Brief. The iron basins in the hall behind her, still dark, still cold, rang faintly with the vibration. Somewhere in the stone above them, the symbols pulsed bright enough that their light reached the corridor. Freyja felt it the moment it hit, the pulse syncing with her own again, and this time something came with it. Not warmth, not the earlier tremor of something waking. This was more like pressure building behind glass, the sensation of something very large in a very small space, not yet moving, simply present and running out of room. She pressed her hand to her collarbone and felt the symbols in the wall brighten against her back. Outside, Thorne's voice cut through the combat for the first time. She hadn't heard it in hours. She'd been so focused on surviving the direct aftermath of what he'd done to her that she'd almost managed to forget the specific quality of it, that carrying, confident boom of a man who had never once doubted his right to be heard. "Bring her out," Thorne said, loud enough to be meant as much for her as for his men. "Or I burn every stone to the ground." Freyja looked at Kaelen. Kaelen looked at her. "He can't burn this fortress," he said. "He doesn't have anything hot enough." "I know," she said. She turned toward the courtyard door. "I'm going to go tell him that myself." She got 3 steps before Kaelen's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard. That was the thing that stopped her more than the grip itself. The deliberate, careful restraint of it. He could have stopped her with force. He had the size for it, the reach, the mass. See, he used none of that. Just his fingers around her wrist and the specific quality of a touch that was asking rather than taking. She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. "Not yet," he said. 2 words, and in them somehow an entire argument, layered, considered, the kind of thing a person arrives at after thinking about it for longer than the conversation has existed. He hadn't decided this just now. He'd been carrying it since she turned toward the door. "He's outside my walls calling for you like you're something he misplaced," Kaelen said. The quietness of his voice made it worse, not better. Quiet like that was the product of enormous effort. If you walk out there right now, or you walk out wounded and without your full capacity, and he will read that as weakness because that is the only language he has ever learned to read. Freyja looked at the courtyard door. Through the iron, through the stone, she could hear the specific shape of what Thorne was doing to her king's territory, the methodical pressure of it, the way his men moved, organized, tireless, capitalizing on every gap. She had watched him build that army for 8 years. She had cataloged every technique, every strategy, every particular cruelty that he'd perfected. She had done it the way you study a natural disaster. Not because you think the knowledge will protect you, but because understanding the thing that will destroy you feels marginally better than not understanding it. She had never once imagined she would be standing on the other side of the wall from him. "I'm not going out there to fight him," she said. "Then why?" "Because he needs to see me standing." She heard her own voice and registered something in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. Not anger, harder than anger and quieter. He branded me and kicked me into the dark, expecting me to die afraid of him. He needs to see that I didn't. Kaelen's hand didn't move from her wrist. His thumb shifted. A small adjustment, barely perceptible, but she felt it. The slight change in pressure that moved from restraint into something more complicated. She looked at where his thumb had settled, directly over her pulse point, and felt the layered discomfort of being known in a specific physical way by someone she had met 3 hours ago. He was checking her heart rate, not strategically, not clinically. The way you reach for something in the dark when you need to know it's still there. She should have pulled away. She had a long and thoroughly justified policy about not permitting that kind of familiarity from people she didn't trust yet. And she didn't trust him yet. She couldn't. Trust was not a thing she could afford to produce on short notice. It had to be built the way scar tissue builds, slowly and with evidence. She knew that. She had learned it the hard way. She didn't pull away. "Your pulse is wrong," he said. "My pulse is fine. It's running too fast for someone claiming to be calm. I'm not claiming to be calm. I'm claiming to be going outside." She looked up at him fully. "There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to be something other than a tactical pause. Then he released her wrist. The absence of his hand was a specific sensation she hadn't expected. Not relief. Something more inconvenient than relief, the particular awareness of a warmth that had existed and now didn't. She filed it in the pile she wasn't examining yet, which was getting unwieldy, and turned back toward the door. The courtyard was bigger than she'd registered in the dark on the way in. Stone, ancient. The ground uneven with age and with the specific weathering of a space that had seen every kind of weather for centuries and had developed a particular relationship with being endured. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls. The fighting had moved to the outer perimeter, and the courtyard itself sat in a strange, suspended pocket of quiet between the sounds of combat beyond the walls and the rain coming down steadily through the open sky above. She walked to the center of it and stopped. Kaelen followed her out. She heard him. He didn't come to stand beside her. He positioned himself slightly behind and to the left, and she understood, without needing to be told, that he was making a choice about space. Not guarding her, not flanking her, bearing witness, making himself available without making himself central. She hadn't known that was something a person could do. Thorne's voice came over the north wall again. Closer now, he'd advanced while his beaters held the feral kings occupied. She could hear the shift in his tone from outside the walls to almost at the gate. He was 50 meters away, maybe 40. Freyja. Her name in his mouth. The particular way he said it. Not cruel, not kind. The absolute absence of both. The tone of a man addressing a thing he owned that had inconveniently relocated. "Come out. I won't ask again." She said nothing. Let him say it to the rain and the stone, and the silence of a place that had been here longer than his entire bloodline. The sound of Thorne's army against the walls was a specific kind of sound she hadn't expected. It wasn't overwhelming. It was persistent. The difference between a storm that breaks things and a tide that simply keeps arriving. Thorne had always understood endurance as a weapon. He had spent 8 years applying it to her specifically. The slow, patient erosion of a person's standing, their resources, their belief in their own right to take up space. She stood in the rain and let herself feel the full weight of that. All 8 years of it, which she had been parceling out to herself in small, manageable increments for so long that she'd almost forgotten the actual mass of it. She let it arrive all at once, standing in the courtyard of the oldest fortress in the Deadlands in the rain. It was immense. It was also, she found, survivable. She had survived all of it in real time. She could survive knowing the sum of it. Behind her, she heard Kaelen exhale. Not loudly, not dramatically. The specific exhale of someone watching someone else carry something heavy and restraining the impulse to take it from them because they understand, on some fundamental level, that the carrying is the point. She didn't turn around. But she was aware of him the way you're aware of the only light source in a dark room, not by looking at it directly, but by the way everything else is illuminated. She thought about what he'd said in the hall. It's been going somewhere. Here. It's been going here. She thought about the symbols in the ceiling lighting up when she walked through the gate, the markers responding to her blood, the compact creature stepping back, the fortress, 3 centuries old, apparently having had her name built into its architecture before she was born. She thought about her mother, reading stories in the dark in a small room she had died in when Freyja was 4. She wondered if her mother had known, if the rough, careful hands and the voice in the dark had been the hands and voice of someone who understood exactly what she was leaving behind and had made the specific, terrible peace of a person who has decided that the most loving thing they can do is prepare someone for a future they won't live to see. The North Gate shuddered, not from combat, from an impact, singular, heavy, applied by one person or one large thing directly to the gate mechanism. Thorne, she understood. Done waiting for his betas to create an opening, deciding to make one himself. Second impact. The gate held. Third. The iron brackets groaned. Freyja looked at the gate and understood, in the same clear, quiet register she'd been understanding things all night, that it would not hold a fourth. She looked back at Kaelen. He was watching the gate. His face in the rain and the torchlight was the face of someone who had done violent things many times, and had never once enjoyed it. The particular composure of a person who has made a permanent peace with their own capacity for destruction, and carries it the way other people carry old injuries. Functional, present, never entirely absent. His eyes moved to hers. She had spent 8 years reading the intentions of powerful men in order to survive them. She had developed a fluency in it that she'd never wanted and had never been able to unlearn. She read Thorne fluently, read his betas, his enforcers, his ranking wolves, knew their tells, their triggers, the specific points at which calculation tipped into impulse. She read Kaelen now with the same trained attention. What she found was not what she was accustomed to finding. There was no performance in him. No curated presentation, no calculated positioning of self, no architecture of image management that she would need to see through in order to find the actual person. Whatever he was it, completely, in all directions, without apparent effort. The fury about her wound was real. The patience with which he'd offered the clay vessel was real. The deliberate care with which he'd held her wrist, checking her pulse, not controlling her, was real. She didn't know what to do with a person who was simply what they were. She had forgotten that was possible. Or perhaps she had never known it, not really, not in a context that included her. She had known it was possible in the abstract, the way you know things are possible that you have never personally witnessed. The fourth impact hit. The gate buckled. Didn't break. Buckled, the iron bowing inward, the hinges shrieking against the stone housing. One more, and it would go. Freyja turned to face it fully. Kaelen moved, not in front of her. Beside her, shoulder to shoulder, half a step back, the position of someone who has placed themselves not as a barrier but as a support. She felt the warmth of him despite the rain, that same impossible, bone-deep warmth of the cloak she'd lost in the snow. She didn't move away from it. "When the gate goes," she said, keeping her voice level, "he'll expect to see me frightened. I know. He built 8 years on my fear. He genuinely doesn't have a strategy for the alternative. I know that too." She watched the buckled gate. The rain came down between her and it, soft and steady. Somewhere on the walls above, she could hear the kings, the particular sounds of the siege turning, the tide of the fight shifting in ways that Thorne's army hadn't prepared for. They'd planned for monsters. What they'd found was something worse, monsters with strategy. "He's going to see me standing next to you," she said. "He's going to understand what that means before I say a word." "Yes, that's going to make him desperate." "Yes, desperate Thorne is more dangerous than confident Thorne." Kaelen was quiet for a moment. The rain filled the silence between them. "Are you telling me to step back?" She looked at the gate, at the buckled iron, at the shape of Thorne's shadow visible through the gap, enormous, broad-shouldered, already certain of the room he was about to walk into. She thought about 4-year-old Freyja and rough, careful hands in the dark. She thought about 11-year-old Freyja standing while everyone else went to their knees and not understanding yet what that meant. She thought about 8 years of being whittled down to a silhouette of a person, stripped of rank and resource, and standing, and finally, tonight, of the very mark of belonging. She thought about the brand on her collarbone, about Thorne's bored face above her in the snow. She thought, "He took everything I had and threw me in the dark, and the dark gave me back something he cannot calculate." "No," she said. The gate went, and Freyja didn't move. She stood in the rain in the center of the oldest courtyard in the Deadlands, wounded and cloakless and cold, with an ancient silver-haired king at her shoulder and the fortress's symbols blazing amber above them both. And she looked at Thorne standing in the wreckage of the gate he'd just broken, and she watched him see her, and she watched his face do something she had never, in 8 years, seen it do. It faltered, just once, just for a moment. A crack in the architecture of his certainty so small she almost missed it, and she wouldn't have caught it at all if she hadn't spent 8 years learning the topography of his confidence well enough to recognize what it looked like when one stone shifted. She said nothing. She just stood in the rain and let him look at what he'd made when he'd tried to unmake her, and she waited. Thorne stood in the wreckage of the gate and said nothing. That was new. She had never, not once, in all the years she had spent inside the walls of his pack, watching him command rooms and break people and build his particular empire of fear, seen him without words. Words were his primary instrument. The Alpha command layered inside them, the weight of absolute certainty, the specific cadence of a man who had learned early that if you spoke as though the world was already arranged to your liking, the world would generally agree. He had nothing. The rain came down between them, 20 feet of courtyard stone, the torchlight catching the buckled iron of the gate behind him, the scatter of his betas in the breach, some held back by what they'd encountered on the outer walls, others simply stopped by the specific quality of the scene in front of them. A wounded woman standing in the rain, not running, not kneeling, not doing anything that Thorne had built his last 8 years expecting her to do. She heard the fighting stop before she consciously registered it. The sounds from the outer walls, the king's methodical grinding dismantling of Thorne's advance, going quiet in stages, from north to east to west, like lights being extinguished one by one. Not silence. The specific aftermath of a fight that has reached its conclusion. The sound of an army that has run the calculation and found the number untenable. Thorne heard it too. She watched him hear it. The slight adjustment in his posture, the rapid, involuntary cost accounting happening behind his amber eyes as he processed what it meant. His betas weren't regrouping, they were done. He had come here with enough men to take an old fortress by attrition. He had not come here with enough men for the feral kings fighting on behalf of something they'd been waiting 2 centuries to protect. That difference was the difference that mattered. She heard them arriving behind her, not rushing, walking with the particular unhurried quality of people who have finished doing what needed doing and are now returning to the place they wanted to be. Bastian first. She could tell by the weight of his footfall, that distinctive ground-registering compression. Then the others, 2 and 3 at a time, taking positions around the courtyard with the natural, uncoordinated ease of people who had been doing this kind of thing together long enough that they didn't need to discuss it. Kaelen remained at her shoulder. He hadn't moved. Thorne's eyes moved across the kings, inventorying, reassessing, and then came back to Freyja. She watched him find the new math and reject it, and find it again. "You look terrible," he said finally. It was the most Thorne thing he could possibly have said, the reflex reaching for contempt when everything else had failed. She recognized it. She had catalogued it years ago. When Thorne is afraid, he reaches for cruelty, because cruelty has never failed him before. "I've had a long night," she said. "Come home, Freyja." The 2 words landed in the courtyard, and she let them land and did not catch them. Come home. As though the place he'd built on her diminishment had ever been a home. As though the small room at the edge of the southern lodge where she'd slept with one ear always listening had been anything other than a managed containment. As though the pack bond he'd branded off her collarbone tonight was something he'd given her rather than something she'd been born with, that he'd decided he had the right to remove. She looked at him and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not rage. She'd expected rage. She'd been braced for it, aware that it was somewhere in the system and ready to manage it. What she felt instead was something quieter and in some ways harder to carry. Grief. Not for him. For the version of her life where none of this had been necessary. The version where she'd been allowed to grow into whatever she was without someone spending 8 years ensuring she didn't. The version where her mother had lived and her pack had been what packs were supposed to be, and she'd never had to develop a fluency in surviving men who were afraid of her. That version had never existed. She understood that. It had never been an available option. The blood she carried had made her a problem to be managed from the moment she was born, and no amount of compliance or smallness on her part would have changed that fundamental truth. But grief doesn't require the thing lost to have ever existed. She had learned that at 4 years old in a small room with rough, careful hands. You can grieve the shape of a life you never got to live. You can hold it for a moment in the rain, acknowledge its weight, and then put it down. She put it down. "I'm not going back," she said. Thorne's jaw tightened. "You don't have the standing to refuse. You're an exile. You have nothing. You are nothing. That's what the brand means. You have no rank, no pack, no... I have this fortress." Her voice was level. "I have these walls, and the compact that protects them, and the 7 kings who hold them." She paused. "And I have whatever you spent 8 years trying to suppress. Which, if tonight is any indication, you were right to be afraid of." Something happened in his face. The crack she'd seen when he first walked through the gate widened slightly. Not visible to anyone who hadn't been studying the architecture of his confidence for nearly a decade. But she saw it. "I will come back," he said, "with twice the numbers. You'll find twice the problem. I will burn every marker in the Deadlands. I will dissolve every compact. I will make this territory uninhabitable." The symbols in the walls blazed. Not the slow, coal-amber pulse she'd been tracking all night. Full brightness, every channel in every wall simultaneously. The light running along the carved lines like something had thrown a switch, flooding the courtyard in amber gold and making the rain visible as individual drops, each one lit for a half-second on its way down. Thorne stepped back. He tried not to. She watched him fight the instinct and lose, one step backward into the wreckage of the gate he'd broken and the specific, devastating indignity of that single retreating step. That was what mattered. That was what his betas would remember. That was what would travel back to his pack before he did, carried in the posture of every man who had been on the outer walls tonight and survived it. Thorne knew it too. She watched him know it. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She stepped forward, just one step, into the lit rain, into the space between where she'd been standing and where he was standing, and she watched him process the fact that she was the one closing the distance, that he was the one who had stopped moving toward her. She lifted her hand and pressed her fingers to the burn on her collarbone, her blood still fresh at the edges where the cold had kept it open. She let him see it, not to wound him with the evidence of what he'd done, but because the wound was the truth of the night, and she was done managing what truths he was permitted to see. "You tried to write an ending for me," she said, "in the snow, with a brand and a locked gate and the certainty that the dark would finish what you started." She held his gaze. The dark had different plans. Thorne looked at her for a long time. She let him look. Then he turned, slowly, with the terrible controlled dignity of a man performing composure for the audience of his remaining betas, and walked back through the gate. His army followed. She stood in the courtyard and listened to them go, the crunch of boots in snow receding, the last sounds of a night that had begun with her on her knees in the mud and was ending with Thorne retreating from her walls. She held the two images together, beginning and end, before and after, and felt the distance between them, enormous and real, and still somehow not fully believable. Kaelen spoke from behind her, quietly, into the rain. "Are you all right? Not, are you hurt? Not, are you safe?" The question he'd chosen was the harder one, the one that required an honest answer rather than a tactical one. She understood the distinction. She understood that he'd made it deliberately. She stood in the lit rain with the fortress blazing amber around her, and the wound open on her collarbone, and 8 years of careful constructed smallness in a pile somewhere at her feet, and she took a full inventory of the question. The answer was no. She was not all right. Not yet. Not in the way that all right means healed and settled and unafraid. She was wounded and cold, and carrying more than she'd been carrying this morning, and the grief she'd put down was still there, set aside rather than resolved. And the thing moving beneath her sternum that she didn't have a name for yet was enormous and frightening, and entirely outside anything she'd been prepared for, but she was standing. She was here. The dark had bowed to her. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. Or she heard him exhale behind her, that careful, considered exhale of a man who has been holding something and decided to set it down for now. Not resolved, set down. She understood that too. Bastian moved past her toward the broken gate, already, practically, assessing what it would take to repair it, running his hands along the buckled iron with the focused attention of someone who deals in structural problems. 2 of the other kings had appeared in the courtyard, watching her with expressions she was going to have to learn the vocabulary for. She turned from the gate and walked toward the fortress door, toward the hall, the cold fire basins and the stone bench and the clay vessel she dropped on the floor, toward whatever the morning was going to bring, which was more than she'd had 6 hours ago, more than she'd had any reason to expect when Thorne's brand had hit her skin and the gates had closed behind her and the blizzard had taken everything that came before. She crossed the threshold. The fortress doors closed behind her, not slammed, not locked, closed. The sound of a place settling around someone who belongs in it. The amber light in the walls dimmed to its quiet, steady pulse, and the rain outside became a sound rather than a reality, and the cold retreated to the edges of the hall where the fire basins waited to be lit again. She stood inside the oldest fortress in the Deadlands and let the door be closed. She let the night be over. She let herself be, for the first time in 8 years, precisely where she was without apology, without strategy. Without the performed smallness, she no longer had a reason to wear. The wound on her collarbone pulsed once, warm, deep, the rhythm of something that had been waiting a very long time, finally permitted to keep its own time. She pressed her hand over it, felt it beat. The narrator's voice drops. Quiet, unhurried. The voice of someone speaking in a warm room while the cold does its work outside. Thorne commissioned the iron before the assembly. He tried to bury her in the snow, but he didn't realize he was planting something. He handed 11 generations of accumulated power directly to the 7 most dangerous beings in the territory. And when he marched to her door to demand his property back, she didn't burn him to the ground. She just turned her back on him. Because that's what it actually looks like when someone is finally done with you. But the Deadlands have older enemies than Thorne. The Queen now has a throne, 7 immortal kings, and a lineage vault full of unanswered questions. If you are ready to stand with Freyja in the wars to come, pledge your loyalty to the Deadlands by subscribing to the channel right now. Leave your mark in the comments below to let the 7 kings know exactly whose side you are on when the real blood spills. Her crown is secured. Her reign is just beginning.